Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of their estate. 23 years of marriage, and she could count on one hand the number of times Richard had told her he loved her in the past 5 years. The silence between them had grown so thick, she sometimes wondered if he even remembered she existed. The mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by an interior designer, every painting selected not for beauty, but for investment value. Richard's world was one of calculated moves and strategic relationships. She had learned to navigate it, attending charity galas and business dinners with a practiced smile, playing the role of the perfect wife to the millionaire everyone admired. But something had changed in recent months. Richard's phone calls had become more secretive, his business trips more frequent. He would disappear for days, claiming urgent matters required his personal attention. Margaret had grown accustomed to his absence, but lately there was something different in his eyes when he looked at her. Not just indifference, but guilt. It was a Tuesday morning when everything began to unravel. Richard had left early, claiming another emergency meeting in the city. Margaret was sorting through his study, looking for the insurance papers their accountant needed, when she noticed a receipt that had fallen behind his desk. The paper was crumpled, as if hastily discarded, but the words were clear enough to make her heart skip a beat. Tiffany & Company, a diamond engagement ring, purchased 3 weeks ago. The price made her dizzy, not because of the amount, but because she was wearing the engagement ring Richard had given her decades ago, and it certainly had not been replaced. Her hands trembled as she smoothed out the receipt. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was a gift for a business associate's daughter, or maybe a token of appreciation for a major client. Richard was generous with his business relationships, often using expensive gifts to maintain important connections. But something deep in her stomach told her this was different. Margaret spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety and doubt. She tried calling Richard twice, but his phone went straight to voicemail. By evening, when he still had not returned, she decided to drive to his downtown office. The building was dark, except for the security lights, and the parking garage was nearly empty. His car was not there. The next morning brought another revelation. While Richard was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text message. Margaret had never been the type to snoop, but desperation had begun to override her principles. The message was from someone named Elena, and the preview showed just enough to make her blood run cold. Everything is ready for Saturday. The flowers arrived this morning and they are beautiful. I cannot wait to be your wife. Margaret set the phone down with shaking hands. The room seemed to spin around her as the reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave. Her husband, the man she had built her life around, was planning to marry someone else. Not planning to divorce her first, not planning to end their marriage with honesty and dignity, but simply planning to take another wife, as if she did not exist. The days that followed were torture. Margaret found herself analyzing every interaction, every conversation, searching for signs she had missed. Richard continued his routine as if nothing had changed, kissing her cheek perfunctorily before leaving for work, making small talk about weather and weekend plans. The normalcy of it all made her feel as though she was losing her mind. But Margaret was not the fragile flower Richard seemed to think she was. 23 years of marriage to a ruthless businessman had taught her a few things about strategy and patience. Instead of confronting him immediately, she decided to gather more information. If Richard was planning to destroy their marriage, she wanted to understand exactly what she was dealing with. She hired a private investigator,
a woman named Sarah Chen who came highly recommended and specialized in matrimonial cases. Sarah was efficient and discreet, promising results within a week. Margaret provided what information she had: the receipt, the text message, and Richard's recent patterns of behavior. The truth, when it came, was worse than she had imagined.
Richard was not just having an affair. He had been living a double life for over 2 years. Elena Vasquez was a 28-year-old art curator he had met at a gallery opening. She lived in a penthouse apartment that Richard had purchased and furnished, drove a car he had bought, and wore jewelry he had selected. To her, Richard was a divorced businessman who had been unlucky in love but was ready to commit to building a new life. The wedding was planned for Saturday at an exclusive resort in the mountains, a small ceremony with only close friends and family. Elena's family had flown in from Spain, believing they were celebrating their daughter's marriage to a successful American businessman who would give her the life she deserved. Richard had told them his previous marriage had ended amicably years ago and that he preferred to keep his past private. Margaret spent Thursday night staring at the investigation report, reading and rereading the details until the words blurred together. Photos showed Richard and Elena shopping for wedding rings, selecting flowers, and tasting cakes. In every image, Richard looked happier than Margaret had seen him in years. His smile was genuine, his posture relaxed. He looked like a man in love. The pain was overwhelming, but alongside it grew something else: anger. Not just at the betrayal, but at the arrogance of it. Richard had not even bothered to divorce her. He had simply decided that he could have both lives, that his wealth and power made him immune to consequences. He was planning to commit bigamy as casually as he might plan a business acquisition. Friday morning, Margaret made her decision. She would not confront Richard privately, would not give him the opportunity to lie or manipulate the situation. She would not allow him to control the narrative or minimize her humiliation. Instead, she would attend his wedding. Sarah had provided her with all the details: the location, the time, even the layout of the resort. Margaret spent Friday afternoon preparing. She chose her outfit carefully: an elegant black dress that Richard had always complimented, paired with the pearl necklace he had given her on their 10th anniversary. She wanted to look like exactly what she was: his wife. Saturday morning came gray and overcast, as if the weather was reflecting the gravity of what was about to unfold. Margaret drove to the mountain resort alone, her hands steady on the steering wheel despite the chaos in her heart. She had no plan beyond showing up, no script prepared for what she would say or do. She only knew that she could not let Richard's betrayal go unchallenged. The resort was beautiful, nestled among pine trees with a view of the valley below. Margaret parked at a distance and walked through the gardens toward the ceremony site. She could hear music playing and the sound of voices and laughter. Through the trees, she could see guests arriving, well-dressed people who had no idea they were attending a bigamous wedding. Margaret found a position where she could observe without being seen, behind a large oak tree at the edge of the ceremony area. The setup was elegant but intimate, with white chairs arranged in neat rows facing a gazebo decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. A string quartet played softly while guests found their seats. She watched Elena arrive in a stunning white gown, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style, her face glowing with happiness. She was beautiful in a way that made Margaret's chest ache, young and vibrant and full of hope. Margaret realized with a sharp pang that Elena was likely innocent in all of this, a victim of Richard's deception just as much as she was.
Richard appeared a few minutes later, wearing a black tuxedo and looking more nervous than Margaret had ever seen him. He kept checking his watch and adjusting his tie, speaking in low, urgent tones with the man who appeared to be his best man. Margaret recognized him as David Sullivan, Richard's business partner and oldest friend. The sight of David participating in this charade added another layer to her anger. The ceremony began with traditional music as Elena walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Margaret watched her husband's face transform as he saw his bride approaching. The nervousness melted away, replaced by a look of pure adoration that Margaret realized she had not seen directed at her in decades. The pain of that realization cut deeper than all the betrayal that had come before.
The officiant, a middle-aged man in ceremonial robes, began the ceremony with words about love and commitment that made Margaret want to scream. He spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, about the promise to forsake all others, about building a life together based on trust and honesty. Every word was a mockery of what was actually happening. Margaret found herself holding her breath as the ceremony progressed through the traditional elements. Elena and Richard exchanged personal vows that spoke of finding each other when they had given up hope, of building a future together, of promises to love and cherish each other forever. Richard's voice was steady and clear as he spoke, and Margaret could hear the sincerity in his tone. He meant every word, which somehow made it worse. The moment came for the exchange of rings. Richard reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, the same box Margaret had seen in the photographs from the investigation report. Elena's face lit up as she saw the ring, a massive diamond that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the gazebo. It was then that Margaret made her decision. She could not stand there silent any longer, watching her husband commit bigamy while speaking of love and commitment. She stepped out from behind the tree and walked deliberately toward the ceremony, her heels clicking on the stone path. The first person to notice her was David Sullivan, whose face went white as he recognized her approaching. He leaned over to whisper something to Richard, who turned to look in her direction. The expression that crossed Richard's face was one Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, terror, and something that might have been relief, all mixed together. The music continued playing, but conversations among the guests began to fade as more people noticed the woman in black walking toward the ceremony. Elena, still facing the officiant, had not yet realized that something was wrong, but she could sense the change in atmosphere and began to turn around to see what was happening. Margaret walked steadily up the aisle, her eyes fixed on Richard's face. She could hear murmurs starting among the guests, voices asking who she was and why she was interrupting the ceremony. When she reached the front row, she stopped and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear. "Richard, I believe you have something that belongs to me."
The silence that followed was deafening. Elena turned fully around now, her face confused and concerned. The officiant looked between Margaret and Richard, clearly uncertain about what was happening. The guests were whispering more urgently, some standing to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she held up for all to see. "This is our marriage certificate," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. "We were married 23 years ago, and as far as I know, we still are, unless you filed for divorce without mentioning it to me." The gasps from the audience were audible now. Elena's face had gone pale, and she was staring at Richard with growing understanding and horror. The officiant stepped forward, his expression grave. "Sir, is this true? Are you currently married to this woman?" For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Margaret could see him calculating, trying to find a way out, a lie that might salvage the situation. But there was no escape from the truth, and finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yes," he said quietly, "Margaret is my wife." The chaos that erupted was immediate and overwhelming. Elena let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and threw her bouquet at Richard's feet. Several of her family members surged forward, her father shouting in rapid Spanish, while her mother reached for her daughter. The guests were on their feet now, voices raised in shock and indignation. But Richard was not finished. In a move that surprised everyone, including Margaret, he suddenly stepped forward and grabbed the microphone from the officiant's hands. "Wait," he called out, his voice amplified over the din. "Please, everyone, wait. I need to say something." The crowd quieted slightly, though the tension remained thick in the air. Elena was crying now, being comforted by her mother, while her father glared at Richard with undisguised fury. Margaret stood perfectly still, watching her husband with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Richard cleared his throat and looked out over the assembled guests, many of whom were his business associates and friends. When he spoke, his voice was shaky but determined. "You are all here because I lied to you," he began. "I told Elena that I was divorced, that I was free to marry her. I told all of you that I had found love again after a difficult past. But the truth is that I am a coward and a fraud. I am married to Margaret, and I have been living a double life because I was too selfish and too weak to face the consequences of my choices."
Margaret felt her mouth fall open. This was not what she had expected. She had thought Richard would try to minimize the situation, to spin it somehow to protect his reputation. Instead, he was confessing publicly to everyone who mattered in his professional and personal life.
"Margaret has been a good wife to me," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "She supported me through the early years when I was building my business. She stood by me through failures and successes. And she deserved better than the distant, selfish man I became. She deserved honesty, and instead, I gave her lies and neglect."
Elena was sobbing openly now, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears. Her family was gathering around her protectively, and Margaret could see the hurt and humiliation in the young woman's eyes. Whatever anger Margaret felt toward Richard, she felt only pity for Elena, who had been as deceived as anyone.
"Elena," Richard said, turning to face his would-be bride, "I am sorry. You are a wonderful woman, and you deserve to know the truth from the beginning. You deserve to make your choices based on honesty, not lies. I stole that from you, and I stole 2 years of your life. I will never forgive myself for that."
The young woman looked up at him through her tears, her face a mask of pain and betrayal. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone picked it up clearly.
"You told me you loved me," she said. "You told me we would build a life together. You let me plan a future that was never real."
Richard nodded, tears now running down his own face.
"I did love you. I do love you. But I loved you selfishly, without consideration for what it would cost you, or what it meant for my responsibilities to Margaret. I thought I could have everything I wanted without facing the consequences, and I was wrong."
The officiant stepped forward and gently took the microphone back. "I think this ceremony needs to end," he said firmly. "This is clearly not a legal marriage, and continuing would be inappropriate and potentially illegal."
But Richard was not done. He turned to Margaret, who had remained silent through his entire confession, and walked toward her.
When he was close enough that only she could hear, he spoke in a voice that was raw with emotion. "I know you will never forgive me," he said. "I know I have destroyed everything between us. But I want you to know that seeing you here, seeing the strength it took for you to come here and face this, reminded me of who you are and who I used to be. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." Margaret looked into her husband's eyes and saw something she had not seen in years. The man she had fallen in love with decades ago. Not the cold businessman he had become, not the calculating manipulator who had been living a double life, but the vulnerable, flawed human being who had once promised to love and cherish her. But it was too late. The damage was too great, the betrayal too complete. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and final. "You are right, Richard. I will never forgive you. Not because I am cruel or unforgiving, but because what you did was not just adultery. It was a complete erasure of my existence, of our marriage, of everything we built together. You did not just cheat on me. You replaced me entirely and pretended I never existed." Richard nodded, accepting her words without argument. Around them, the guests were beginning to disperse, uncomfortable with the private drama they had witnessed. Elena's family had surrounded her and was leading her away from the gazebo, her wedding dress trailing behind her in the dirt. Margaret turned to leave, but Richard called after her. "Margaret, wait! What happens now? What do we do?" She turned back to face him one last time. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. You will hear from my attorney on Monday. You will discover that your wife is not as naive or helpless as you assumed, and you will learn that actions have consequences, even for millionaires." As Margaret walked away from the ruins of Richard's second wedding, she felt something she had not experienced in years: power. For the first time in their marriage, she was not reacting to Richard's choices, but making her own. The scared, abandoned woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who would not be dismissed or ignored. The drive home gave Margaret time to think about what had just happened and what would come next. Richard's public confession had been shocking, but it had also been strategic. By admitting his guilt in front of all those witnesses, he had controlled the narrative and perhaps gained some sympathy as a man who had made mistakes but was willing to own them. Margaret realized that even in his moment of apparent honesty, Richard was still thinking like a businessman. But Margaret had advantages Richard did not know about. The private investigator had uncovered not just the affair and the planned bigamy, but also financial irregularities in Richard's business dealings. Money that should have been reported as taxable income had been hidden in offshore accounts. Business expenses that were personal in nature had been deducted inappropriately. Richard's double life had required financing, and that financing had come at the cost of legal and ethical corners being cut. More importantly, Margaret had spent 23 years as the wife of a successful businessman. She had attended countless meetings, dinners, and conferences. She had listened to conversations about deals, investments, and strategies. Richard had often dismissed her presence as decorative, assuming she was not paying attention or would not understand the complexities of his business world. He had been wrong on both counts. Margaret knew where Richard kept his important documents, knew his passwords and security codes, knew the names and contact information of his most important clients and partners. She knew which deals were legitimate and which ones existed in gray areas of the law. Most importantly, she knew that Richard's reputation was everything to him, and that reputation
was now in her hands. The weeks that followed Richard's failed wedding were chaotic and painful for everyone involved. The story spread quickly through their social circles, fed by the dozens of witnesses who had seen the confrontation. Richard's business suffered as clients questioned his integrity and reliability. Elena disappeared from the city entirely, reportedly returning to Spain to recover from the humiliation.
Margaret threw herself into the divorce proceedings with the focused intensity of someone who had been awakened from a long sleep. Her attorney was impressed by the thoroughness of her preparation and the strength of her case. Richard's attempts to negotiate a quiet settlement were met with firm refusal. Margaret wanted everything exposed, every lie revealed, every hidden asset brought into the light. The most shocking revelation came when Margaret's forensic accountants discovered that Richard had been embezzling from his own company to finance his double life. The penthouse apartment, the expensive gifts, the lavish trips with Elena had all been paid for with money that belonged to shareholders and business partners. Richard had been stealing from the people who trusted him most. When confronted with this evidence, Richard finally realized that his problems extended far beyond divorce court. Criminal charges were likely, and his business empire was crumbling. The man who had once controlled every aspect of his life through careful planning and ruthless execution now found himself completely powerless. The final confrontation between Margaret and Richard took place in the law offices where their divorce was being finalized. Richard looked haggard and defeated, nothing like the confident millionaire who had stood at the altar just months before. His legal troubles had mounted, his business was in receivership, and his reputation was destroyed. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, as they waited for the final papers to be signed. "I thought I could manage both situations, keep everyone happy." Margaret looked at him with something that might have been pity. "That was always your problem, Richard. You thought you could control everything and everyone. You thought your money and power made you immune to the consequences of your choices. You forgot that other people have minds and hearts and lives that matter. What will you do now?" he asked. "The house, the business assets, your settlement, you will be wealthy in your own right." Margaret smiled, and for the first time Richard could remember, it was not a smile meant to please him or make him comfortable.
"I am going to live, Richard. For the first time in 23 years, I am going to make choices based on what I want, not what you need or what looks good for your image. I am going to remember who I was before I became your wife, and I am going to discover who I can become now that I am free of you." The divorce was finalized on a cold December morning, exactly 8 months after Richard's failed wedding. Margaret walked out of the courthouse a wealthy woman, but more importantly, she walked out as her own person for the first time in decades. Richard's story ended very differently. The criminal charges resulted in a conviction for embezzlement and fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, though he would likely serve less with good behavior. His business empire was dissolved, his assets seized to pay back investors and creditors. The man who had once commanded respect and wielded enormous power became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and moral compromise. Elena, according to mutual friends, had recovered from the ordeal and was reportedly engaged to a doctor in Madrid who knew her complete story and loved her anyway. She had refused any contact with Richard after the wedding disaster, and Margaret respected her choice to move forward without looking back.
Margaret used her divorce settlement to start a foundation that provided legal and financial assistance to women leaving abusive marriages. She discovered that her years of observing Richard's business dealings had given her a keen understanding of finance and strategy that served her well in her new role. She also returned to school to complete the art history degree she had abandoned when she married Richard. 2 years after the divorce, Margaret was invited to speak at a conference about financial abuse in marriages. As she stood at the podium looking out at an audience of attorneys, social workers, and survivors, she reflected on the journey that had brought her there. "I spent 23 years believing that my worth came from being married to a successful man," she told the audience. "I thought that as long as I played my role perfectly, as long as I was beautiful and charming and supportive, I would be safe and valued. I never imagined that the man I trusted with my life would be capable of such complete betrayal."
She paused, thinking about that terrible day when she had discovered Richard's receipt, the moment when her comfortable world had begun to crumble. But betrayal, as devastating as it is, can also be liberation. It can force you to confront truths about yourself and your life that you have been avoiding. It can strip away illusions and leave you with nothing but reality, which is terrifying, but also powerful. Because when you have nothing left to lose, you discover what you are truly capable of. The audience was quiet, listening intently to her words. "I am not grateful for what Richard did to me. I would not choose to go through that pain again. But I am grateful for what I discovered about myself in the aftermath. I learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, more capable than I had been allowed to be, and more valuable than I had been taught to believe." The audience was quiet, listening intently to her words. "I am not grateful for what Richard did to me. I would not choose to go through that pain again. But I am grateful for what I discovered about myself in the aftermath. I learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, more capable than I had been allowed to be, and more valuable than I had been taught to believe." Margaret concluded her speech with words that had become her personal motto. "The people who betray us often think they are taking something from us, but sometimes, without meaning to, they give us the greatest gift of all, the chance to become who we were always meant to be." As she left the conference that day, Margaret thought about Richard, probably sitting in his prison cell, finally facing the consequences of his choices. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but she felt no regret either. He had made his decisions, and she had made hers. The difference was that her decisions had been based on truth, courage, and self-respect, while his had been based on selfishness, cowardice, and the illusion that power could shield him from accountability. The millionaire who had thought he could have everything had lost everything that truly mattered. The wife who had been discarded and betrayed had found herself and built a new life based on purpose and authenticity. In the end, the truth had indeed set them both free, though in very different ways than either had expected. Margaret's story became an inspiration to many women who found themselves in similar situations. She proved that it was possible to survive betrayal, to rebuild after devastation, and to create a life that was richer and more meaningful than what had been lost. She showed that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you ever do for yourself. And Richard's story became a warning about the dangers of believing that wealth and power make you immune to consequences. His fall from grace was complete and public, a reminder that no one, no matter how successful or influential, is above the basic requirements of honesty, integrity, and respect for others. The shocking thing Richard did was not just the bigamy, not just the betrayal, not just the embezzlement. The most shocking thing was his complete miscalculation of the woman he had been married to for over 2 decades. He had underestimated her intelligence, her strength, and her capacity for strategic thinking. He had assumed she would accept his betrayal quietly, perhaps even gratefully, as long as he provided financial security. Instead, Margaret had proven that she was every bit as formidable as he was, perhaps more so because her actions were motivated by justice rather than greed. She had outmaneuvered him completely, using his own arrogance and assumptions against him. In trying to discard her, he had created his most dangerous opponent. The tale of Richard and Margaret became legendary in their social circles, a story told and retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception and the power of truth. But for Margaret, it was not a story at all. It was simply her life, lived on her own terms for the first time, and that made all the difference. 3 years after the divorce, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at her foundation office. Elena Vasquez stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. She was different from the broken woman Margaret remembered from the failed wedding, more confident and self-assured, though there was still a shadow of vulnerability in her eyes. "I hope you do not mind me coming here," Elena said, her Spanish accent still noticeable but her English much improved. "I have been wanting to speak with you for a very long time." Margaret gestured for her to sit down, curious about what had brought Richard's former fiancé to see her after all this time. Elena settled into the chair across from Margaret's desk, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I wanted to thank you," Elena began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the conversation. "I know that sounds strange, considering the circumstances of how we met. But what you did that day, stopping the wedding, it saved my life."
Margaret raised an eyebrow, surprised by this perspective. "I was not trying to save anyone. I was just trying to stop my husband from committing bigamy." Elena nodded. "I understand that, but you need to know what would have happened if you had not come. Richard had been pressuring me to sign a prenuptial agreement that would have left me with nothing if the marriage ended. He said it was just a formality, that his lawyers insisted on it for tax purposes. I was so in love, so trusting, that I would have signed anything he put in front of me." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "After the wedding disaster, I discovered that Richard had taken out large insurance policies on my life, with himself as the beneficiary. My lawyer believes he was planning to have an accident arranged after we were married. I would have been eliminated, and he would have collected millions while still being married to you." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had known Richard was capable of betrayal and deception, but the thought that he might have been planning murder was beyond anything she had imagined. The man she had lived with for over 2 decades, the man who had shared her bed and her life, had been contemplating not just bigamy, but potentially homicide? "Are you certain about this?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a folder. "These are copies of the insurance documents and some emails my lawyer recovered from Richard's computer during the criminal investigation. The authorities could not prove intent to commit murder, but the evidence is very suggestive." Margaret reviewed the documents with growing horror. The insurance policies were substantial, totaling over $10 million, and the emails discussed Elena's daily routines, her habits, and her planned activities after the honeymoon. One message chain involved a man whose background check revealed connections to organized crime figures. "Have you shown this to the police?" Margaret asked. "Yes, but Richard was already in prison by then, and they said the evidence was circumstantial. They could not prove he intended to harm me, only that he had prepared financially to benefit from my death. But I know in my heart what he was planning." Margaret set the documents down, her hands shaking slightly. The scope of Richard's deception and malice was even greater than she had realized. He had not just betrayed 2 women, He had potentially planned to murder one of them for financial gain. I came here today because I wanted you to know that your courage that day did more than expose his lies, Elena continued. It literally saved my life. And I wanted to tell you that I have started a support group in Madrid for women who have been deceived by men they trusted. I tell them your story, how you found the strength to fight back when everything seemed hopeless. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent years processing the betrayal and rebuilding her life, but she had never fully understood the broader impact of her decision to confront Richard at the wedding. Knowing that her actions had potentially saved Elena's life gave new meaning to all the pain she had endured. "There is something else," Elena said, her voice becoming more hesitant. "I have been in contact with 2 other women who were involved with Richard before he met me. It turns out that we were not his only victims. There was a pattern going back years, maybe decades." This revelation was equally shocking. Margaret had assumed that Elena was Richard's first affair, the midlife crisis that had destroyed their marriage. The possibility that Richard had been systematically deceiving women throughout their entire marriage was almost too much to process. Elena pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. "This is Sarah Chen, the private investigator you hired. She continued investigating Richard even after your divorce was finalized. She discovered at least 4 other women over the past 15 years who had relationships with Richard while he was married to you. 2 of them also had suspicious insurance policies taken out on their lives." Margaret's world tilted again. She had thought she understood the scope of Richard's betrayal, but each new revelation showed her that she had only seen the tip of the iceberg. The man she had been married to was not just an unfaithful husband, but potentially a serial predator who used his wealth and charm to lure vulnerable women into dangerous situations. Why did Sarah continue investigating after my case was closed? She suspected there was more to discover, and she was concerned about Richard's pattern of behavior. She has been working with law enforcement agencies in several states to build a larger case. She asked me to give you this. Elena handed Margaret a 3rd folder, this one marked with Sarah's business letterhead. Inside was a comprehensive report detailing Richard's activities over the past 20 years, including financial records, travel documents, and testimonies from multiple women who had been involved with him. Margaret spent the next hour reviewing the documents while Elena waited patiently. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Richard would identify women who were financially vulnerable or emotionally isolated, sweep them off their feet with his wealth and charm, isolate them from their friends and family, and then begin preparing for their elimination. In several cases, the women had died in accidents or from sudden illnesses that benefited Richard financially. "How many women are we talking about?" Margaret asked when she finished reading. "At least 7 that Sarah has identified, possibly more. 3 of them died under circumstances that are now being investigated as potential homicides. The others, like me, escaped when relationships ended or when Richard's attention turned elsewhere." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She had been married to a man who was potentially a serial killer, sleeping beside him every night, sharing meals and conversations and intimacies with someone who was systematically murdering other women. The thought that she had somehow escaped his attention, that she had been spared because she was useful to him as a wife rather than expendable as a mistress, was both terrifying and shameful. "Why are you telling me all of this now?" Margaret asked. "Why not 3 years ago when you first discovered it?" Elena's expression grew sad. "Because 3 years ago, I was too broken to think about anything except my own pain. I spent months in therapy trying to understand how I could have been so deceived, how I could have fallen in love with a monster. It took me a long time to realize that Richard was not just a cheating husband, but something much more dangerous." She leaned forward in her chair. her voice becoming more intense. But also because the investigation is reaching a critical point. The authorities believe they have enough evidence to file additional charges against Richard for the deaths of at least 2 women. They need testimony from survivors like you and me to establish his pattern of behavior and motive. Margaret understood immediately what Elena was asking. Testifying in a murder trial would mean reliving all the pain and humiliation of Richard's betrayal in a very public forum. It would mean having her private life dissected by defense attorneys who would try to make her appear vindictive or unreliable. It would mean facing Richard again, looking into the eyes of the man she had once loved, and acknowledging that he was capable of murder. "I need time to think about this," Margaret said finally. "This is not a decision I can make lightly." Elena nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I hope you will consider it. These women deserve justice, and their families deserve answers. And there may be other women out there who are still in danger from Richard or men like him." After Elena left, Margaret sat alone in her office for a long time, trying to process everything she had learned. The foundation she had built was dedicated to helping women escape abusive marriages, but she had never imagined that her own experience involved potential murder. The work she was doing suddenly felt more urgent and important than ever. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself unable to focus on anything else. She researched the cases Sarah had documented, reading newspaper articles about women who had died in suspicious accidents or from sudden illnesses. In every case, there was a connection to Richard, though often disguised through business relationships or social connections. The most disturbing case involved a woman named Jennifer Walsh, a widow with 2 teenage children who had been dating Richard for 6 months before she died in a skiing accident. The accident had occurred on a trip Richard had planned and paid for, at a resort where he had connections with the staff. Jennifer's death had resulted in a $5 million insurance payout that Richard had collected as her beneficiary, money he had used to purchase the penthouse apartment he later gave to Elena.
Margaret realized that Elena's apartment, the place where Richard had played house with his young fiancée, had been paid for with blood money from a murdered woman. The jewelry he had given Elena, the trips they had taken, the romantic dinners and expensive gifts had all been financed by the death of an innocent mother who had trusted him with her heart and her life. The decision to testify became easier after that revelation. Margaret could not bring Jennifer Walsh back to life, could not undo the suffering of her children, but she could ensure that Richard faced the full consequences of his actions. She could help make sure that other women would be warned about the dangers of men who seemed too good to be true. Margaret called Sarah Chen and agreed to cooperate fully with the murder investigation. The process was grueling, involving hours of interviews, document reviews, and psychological evaluations. Margaret had to relive not just her own betrayal, but also examine her marriage through the lens of Richard's potential violence against other women. The hardest part was accepting that she had missed signs of Richard's true nature. Looking back with the knowledge of what he was capable of, she could see moments when his mask had slipped, when the charming businessman had revealed glimpses of something colder and more calculating underneath. She remembered conversations where he had spoken dismissively about women who had disappeared from his life, describing them as unstable or demanding when they had probably been victims of his manipulation. The trial, when it finally began, was a media sensation. Richard's fall from respected businessman to accused serial killer captured public attention in a way that few cases do. Margaret found herself at the center of a story that was simultaneously personal and universal, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the importance of listening to instincts. Taking the stand was one of the most difficult things Margaret had ever done. She had to describe her marriage in detail, explaining how Richard had isolated her from friends and family, how he had controlled their finances, and how he had systematically eroded her self-confidence. She had to admit that she had suspected he was having affairs, but had been too afraid to confront him directly. The defense attorney, as expected, tried to portray Margaret as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge through false accusations. He suggested that her decision to divorce Richard had been motivated by greed rather than betrayal, and that her testimony was unreliable because of her emotional involvement in the case. But Margaret was prepared for these attacks. 3 years of therapy and self-reflection had given her a clear understanding of her own motivations and experiences. She answered every question honestly and directly, never allowing the attorney to shake her confidence or make her doubt her own perceptions. Elena's testimony was equally powerful. She described Richard's systematic grooming process, how he had isolated her from her family and friends, and how he had pressured her to make him the beneficiary of her insurance policies. She spoke about the fear she had felt when she discovered the truth, not just about his existing marriage, but about his potential plans for her future. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Sarah Chen, who described her investigation and the patterns she had discovered in Richard's relationships. Financial experts explained how Richard had used his victims' deaths to fund his lifestyle and subsequent relationships. Medical experts testified about the suspicious circumstances surrounding several deaths, including toxicology results that suggested poisoning in at least 2 cases. Richard's defense was built around the argument that he was guilty of adultery and fraud, but not murder. His attorneys claimed that the insurance policies were legitimate investments, that the deaths had been genuinely accidental, and that the prosecution was trying to turn a case of marital infidelity into something much more sinister than it actually was. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of behavior was too consistent, the financial motives too clear, and the circumstances surrounding the deaths too suspicious to be explained by coincidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of first-degree murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Margaret watched her former husband's face for any sign of remorse or recognition of what he had done. She saw nothing but cold calculation, as if he was already planning his appeal and considering his options. After the trial, Margaret returned to her foundation work with renewed purpose. She expanded the organization's mission to include education about financial abuse and predatory behavior, using her own story and the stories of Richard's other victims to warn women about the dangers of relationships that seemed too perfect to be true. She also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop training programs for investigators dealing with cases of domestic abuse and suspected murder. Her experience with Richard had taught her that wealthy, charming men were often the most dangerous predators because they had the resources to manipulate systems and the social standing to avoid suspicion. Elena returned to Spain but maintained regular contact with Margaret. They had formed an unlikely friendship based on their shared trauma and their commitment to protecting other women from similar fates. Elena's support group in Madrid grew into a network that spanned multiple countries, connecting survivors of manipulative relationships and providing resources for women trying to escape dangerous situations. 5 years after Richard's conviction, Margaret received a letter from Jennifer Walsh's daughter, now in college and studying criminal justice. The young woman wrote about her mother's death and her determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. She had followed the trial closely and wanted to thank Margaret for her courage in testifying. "My mother always told us to trust our instincts," the letter read.
She said that if something seemed too good to be true, it probably was. I think she might have had doubts about Richard, but she was so lonely after my father died, and he seemed to offer everything she had been missing. Your testimony helped me understand that she was not naive or foolish. She was just human, and she deserved better than what he gave her. Reading those words, Margaret finally felt a sense of closure about her role in the tragedy. She had not been able to save Jennifer Walsh or the other women who had died because of Richard's greed and cruelty, but she had helped ensure that their deaths were not forgotten and that their killer faced justice.
Margaret's foundation continued to grow, eventually becoming a national organization that helped thousands of women each year. Her story became a cornerstone of their educational programs, a real-world example of how manipulation and abuse could escalate into violence and murder. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and consulted with other organizations, always emphasizing the importance of trusting instincts and seeking help when relationships felt wrong. Richard died in prison 7 years into his sentence, killed by another inmate who had learned about his crimes against women. Margaret felt neither satisfaction nor sadness at the news of his death. He had been a chapter in her life that was already closed, a reminder of who she had been before she found the strength to become who she was meant to be. The foundation Margaret built became her true legacy, a living testament to the power of survival and the importance of turning pain into purpose. She had taken the worst experience of her life and used it to help others avoid similar fates. In doing so, she had found meaning and peace that her comfortable life as Richard's wife had never provided. Looking back, Margaret realized that Richard's betrayal, as devastating as it had been, had given her something invaluable: the chance to discover her own strength and use it to make a difference in the world. She would not choose to experience that pain again, but she was grateful for the person it had helped her become and the lives she had been able to touch because of it.